I'm Krista Svalbonas. I'm an artist based in Philadelphia, and my work deals with ideas of home, sense of place, and migration. For the past 5 years, I've been working on 2 series, one titled Displacement, which captures former World War II refugee housing in Germany, and then also a series of Soviet buildings built during Soviet occupation in the Baltic countries titled What Remains. My work in general deals with the Baltic history of displacement and diaspora with the countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia.
Thanks for being here. We just had the opening for the show last night, which I thought was pretty well attended, and people were really engaged in the talk. We're just kind of back also from showing the work in Paris Photo, which I was pretty overwhelmed by the response that people had, because it is kind of an obscure history of the Baltic nations. And so the exhibition is celebrating the completion of these 2 projects. I think originally I was wanting to wait for the forthcoming publication, but after the response in Paris, I really felt we needed, that kind of time was now to do a show of the work, and you've kind of completed these 2 projects, which have consumed you in addition to teaching and running the department at your university for the last 5 years. So we are looking at 2 projects, Displacement, which is encompassed by about 30 pieces, and the What Remains pieces behind us, which are comprised of about 18 works. And so I wondered, in short, the work is looking at the history of the Baltic nations, and specifically displaced persons after World War II in Germany, later back in the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and dealing with the difficulties of living under Soviet occupation at that time. So as we've talked about before, I needed you to give me a bit of backstory, because a lot, as we've talked about, it's kind of a little known history. It's sort of a small segment of the general World War II history and Cold War history that, at least here, doesn't get talked about so much. So starting with the earlier body of work, the displacement pieces, which are these laser-cut architectural photographs you've made all across Germany that have transcriptions of letters, plea letters essentially, from displaced persons who are living in these camps, trying to get out of Germany to the US or the UK, Canada as well, I believe. So I wonder, maybe, I want to talk about both the narrative of this work and then the kind of process side, because I think why people responded to it, and myself responded to the work so strongly, is that it's really this great meeting of human story, narrative, that's very powerful. I think also because it comes from your family history, so it's got this extra power to it as you're deeply connected to it, which we'll briefly touch on. But then it's also got this really unique execution through the process of laser cutting, having these kind of patterned edges. So we'll kind of touch on both of these, but I wonder if you can give us a quick background, starting sort of at the end of World War II, how the story of the Baltic people and how they had to go kind of back and forth from their own home countries to Germany, and so.
The easiest way to talk about that is in 1941, when the Soviet army came into the Baltic states. In June of that year, they sent thousands of people in wagon cars to Siberia. They deported thousands of people over to these forced labor camps, or gulags, in Siberia. And as you can imagine, the conditions were very harsh, so not many people survived. And in 1942, when the German army came in, those deportations halted, in a sense, and the paperwork for the continued deportations was released, so families could find out that their names were on the list to be have been deported had the deportations continued.
This list was public?
Yeah, it was kind of distributed or released by the German, army at that time, the German government at the
by
time.
the German government?
Yeah.
Not the, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, when the Germans came in.
Gotcha.
And then in 1944, when the Soviet army was coming back into the Baltic countries, all of these individuals who knew their names were on these lists from previously, they decided to flee because they knew that their time was going to be probably limited. And so they fled west towards Germany, and then eventually, as the Allied forces took over Germany, they ended up in these displaced person camps, these refugee camps, in the Allied zones of the UK, US, and French.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that, when we think of camps and we think of World War II, there's the obvious camps related to the Holocaust that we imagine, and so I think we tend to imagine barbed wire and barracks, but the buildings in your series, which are these camps, are like administrative buildings. Some of them look like homes. How did they end up in those kind of buildings versus like what? I guess this is now post-war, do you know how the buildings were chosen or any significance to the individual process of that? Yeah,
there's some interesting stories, like historical stories revolving around that. So obviously Germany had been heavily bombed, so whatever was available was used in any kind of resource fashion. But there are some interesting stories about spaces that were used. So in several cases, refugees, the local German population was displaced actually out of their own homes to accommodate refugee population. And that was done, the Allied governments did that with individuals who were Nazi sympathizers. And so they displaced them out of their own homes and then put refugees in there. And then in the case of other spaces, which I couldn't document because they've been torn down, but refugees were housed in former concentration camps. There's several Baltic people that were housed in forced labor camps, Jewish forced labor camps. So, and those obviously don't really exist to document those anymore, but anything and everything was used.
And what's the time frame of people living in these spaces and writing the letters that we see cut into the photographs?
Yeah.
Roughly the years?
Yeah, so...
it wasn't just like a few weeks or a couple months, right? This was many years of people living in these places.
Yeah, so the camps were operational for about 10 years. So that's from 1946 or late 45 to 55, 56. So.
Okay. And so kind of backing up a little bit, at least from your connection to this work, your work, prior to this is more or less always dealt with ideas of home and displacement and immigration through the eyes of architecture, but more so in painting, drawing, portraiture. You've done a lot of different medium. I wonder if you could give us a tidbit of your familial connection, which is more in the displacement work, and how this really became a personal project to you.
I grew up with this history of parents who were refugees and grandparents who were refugees who came to the States with that narrative. And always as a child, I remember hearing these stories and knowing that fact and kind of growing up with that history in the States. And at a certain point, I was really interested in investigating it and understanding what that was, what it meant to be a refugee, what it meant to live in these spaces, what these spaces were, what life was like in these places, and that's how I started. That's how I started working on it. It was really an investigation of personal family history, and then it expanded to become something so much bigger than that.
And what is the family history?
So both of my parents were refugees. They lived in those displaced person camps along with my grandparents.
Okay, so they would have been like children?
Yes.
At the time?
Yeah,
okay.
That's right. They would have been children. So, and then on both sides of my family, individuals were sent to Siberia. Some survived, some didn't.
Wow.
And then, which is what prompted them to leave when the Soviet occupation was coming in again, the Soviet army. But yeah, they were about children ages 5 through 9 when they were living in those camps with my grandparents.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that kind of brings us up to the first part of the work we're looking at from the displacement project. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of move a little further into the 20th century with the works from What Remains, which are these kind of definitely still connected both from a aesthetic and visual perspective to the displacement work. We still see the laser cutting process, which we'll talk about in a minute, but now we see these large kind of Soviet-era brutalist buildings, and now we're back with this work. We're back in the Baltic states, right? We're not. Yeah. We've left Germany, and we're back in Latvia, Lithuanian, and some from Estonia as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the significance of these buildings and what their role was in this story? Yeah. So these buildings were all buildings that were built during Soviet occupation of all 3 Baltic countries. And then I'm pairing the buildings with traditional folk textile patterns. And so those are textile patterns that you would see in family like tablecloths, kind of the nice tablecloth that you would lay out if there was a gathering or a special dinner. You'd see it in curtains, mittens, scarves, that kind of thing. And during occupation, there was a very concerted effort of forced cultural suppression, kind of create this sort of homogeneous Soviet Union, kind of eradicate that kind of sense of individuality of the countries that the Soviet Union had usurped. And so continuing to practice these traditions was really seen as an act of political resistance. And would this have been, I've kind of referred to it when I'm showing people the work as sort of a soft protest. And it seems to me that this inherently with the type of crafts that you're talking about, that these were mostly acts of resistance by women and perhaps older women. Is that accurate to a certain extent? Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, it's definitely by women for sure, but I think it runs sort of the gamut as far as age goes. And yeah, there was, because the oppression was so forceful, people were, they were monitored, people were afraid to even talk about anything against the political regime at the time. So continuing these traditions and kind of keeping that alive, however that could happen, was sort of almost the only way that they could kind of rebel against the occupation and not be sent. I mean, the Siberia deportation still continued during occupation. So people were always, afraid that they were going to either be, arrested or deported or taken away. Yeah. And these buildings all still exist? Yes. I mean, you've photographed these just in the last couple of years. Yes. So obviously an immense amount of research and time on Google Maps, I imagine, and trying to see before you go out to see if these buildings still exist, because I imagine in your research you found general locations and anecdotes about whether or not these buildings still exist, especially the buildings in Germany, because it's so much further back in history. So how did you come upon this idea of, when you found these buildings, I mean, you could have just gone and made a photograph and look how interesting it is that this building still exists and modern day people are going about their lives, they don't even know. You talked about that in our conversation at the opening about how German citizens today would walk up to you and be like, why are you photographing this building? This building's not interesting. Like, well, actually, this has some great stories in it, but you went beyond just making architectural photographs, though you do have some portraits, which we'll talk about, but how did you arrive to this idea, this kind of moment of laser cutting, which has this great power of sort of having somewhat of an aggressive, burning and cutting, which I imagine sort of symbolizes trauma in a sense, and how did you arrive at that and think that this was the way to tell this story through a physical process?
Yeah, I mean, it was enormously hard to find the locations of all these spaces, and there was a huge amount of research done for several months on just that, including Google mapping and Google Earth, with kind of any kind of address that I could get out of various archives, or any maps that I could find out of various archives as well. So once I did my first round of documentation, which was in 2017, I think, I had all of these images, and I wasn't sure how I was going to approach the story. And the story was very personal, of course. I visited the camp that my mother was in and my father was in, and I think because of that personal connection, it made it all the more difficult for me to figure out how I was going to realize this work and tell this story. But in the archives, I also found so many letters that the refugees were sending to the US, Canada, and the UK, asking for asylum. So essentially explaining that they couldn't go back home. They would be seen as enemies of the state, and so they had to find a home elsewhere. And at the time, I was learning how to use a laser cutter, and something just sort of kind of like a light bulb just kind of hit. And I thought, can I take their words and then my photographs and somehow unite them? And the process of burning seemed, as you mentioned, like very poignant. It talks about war, it talks about trauma. So the idea of kind of burning their words into my photographs was something that I was really interested in trying to do. So it took a while, but then I figured out a process that actually worked. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the effect is really excellent. It's always amazing to me looking at them up close how sharp the cutting is. It's not the pieces have certain areas that might get kind of visually a little chaotic, but you can always read pretty clearly portions of the text at a really small size. And even in the What Remains pieces, which have also this kind of symbolic binary contrast between the textile patterns, which, as we talked about earlier, kind of come from this, I think, this feminine background, or I'm thinking of this kind of soft material that these exist on, in contrast to these giant, hulking, concrete, brutalist structures. Like for example, one of the things I really find interesting in some of the displacement pieces is that, you know, people are always trying to read, like they're trying to read the whole thing, and but I like in a few of them, they start with the introduction to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, which is a really fascinating. Can you say a bit about her role in this story?
Yeah, sure. She was a very important figure at that time. She was petitioning, she was a champion of refugees. She was petitioning the US government to accept refugees, and she was instrumental in pushing forward the Displaced Person Act, which allowed 250,000 refugees into the US. So yeah, they were actively writing to her quite often. Yeah.
So now that you have essentially finished these projects, I mean, you're sort of part of the Baltic diaspora, living in the US, growing up in the US, but having this very intimate connection to this location. And now that you've finished the work and you have essentially a tour of a museum exhibition that is traveling the Baltic states as we speak, how is the response to contemporary people living there? Do they feel a deep connection to this story, especially the younger generation, or is it something that's really tied to the older generation? Is it connecting in a more powerful way there, or I'm just curious how, you know, versus Americans or other Europeans that have seen the work recently, how are people there responding to the work?
Yeah, it's been an interesting response to the work over there. So the work's traveled to all three Baltic countries. Right now it's in Latvia, but before that it was in Lithuania, and then before that Estonia. And During Soviet occupation, there was quite a bit of propaganda about the individuals that fled and that left. So there was the statement that they had gone and decided to live a better life and had decided to go away and willingly left, and there was no sort of necessity for these individuals to flee, actually.
Is it like portrayed as like a betrayal? Or
Like maybe it was just portrayed as these individuals, they chose to leave and then they wanted to,
right.
go find a better life in the Western, So that narrative has been shifting for years now, and it's being realized that was actually an incorrect narrative that was produced during Soviet occupation, and of course with the crisis in the Ukraine, which is right next door to the Baltic countries, and is very close by. So this work has gained a lot of traction, and people are talking about it more. It feels very relevant to talk about the past and then also talk about what's happening now. So it's been received in a very positive way.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate to say that it's timely, and probably will continue to be so. But we talked about in writing about the work of that it bore implications on the current climate of forced migrations that we see in various parts of the world. So, my hat's off to you for kind of using your practice to shine a light on these kinds of stories, which obviously has a lot of significance to this specific story, but as we just said, it really kind of shines a light on other stories. So you, in addition to the physical pieces, when you've been out there traveling, you've made 100+ interviews with surviving refugees. You've made a lot of really touching portraits that I find to be really humble, and they're in the domestic setting in these people's living room with their personal family portraits. And what I really love is in a lot of those you see evidence of these patterns. There was a shawl on the sofa arm, or there's some tapestry hanging that has these patterns, so that really connects this whole story. Where do you see this project going? We hope into some published form, using these portraits, using these interviews. Is that something that you're steering towards to kind of not wrap up this project, but to really bring it full circle?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, that's what I am working on right now, like quite diligently, is trying to figure out how to compile all of this data that I have. So there's archival data, there's interviews, there are the portraits, of course there's the work that I photographed of the former camps, and trying to figure out how that might meet in a publication, and then continue to disseminate this history in a much wider and broader kind of landscape.
Yeah, the book format is obviously ideal for really getting the work out there to a larger audience that maybe isn't going to exhibitions, or maybe isn't, going to art fairs in big city centers. So, well, we very much look forward to that. And thank you again for all the time you've put into this project, and for shining a light on these kind of little known stories. And I imagine your family must be quite proud to see it in
I like to think so,
its completion. Yeah. So congratulations again, and thanks for your exhibition.
Oh, well, thanks for enjoying the work.
Yeah.